Hello, everyone who's joining us online here on Zoom for this conversation about the aftermath of Germany's election hosted by Das Progressive Zentrum. We're going to be discussing Germany's political turning point, change or progress. I'm Jeremy Cliffe, the international editor of the New Statesman, based here in Berlin. Some viewers may know that we've been covering this election closely and are very interested in the aftermath. So I was very grateful to the DPZ for inviting me to host this discussion. And I'm also very glad because we have two great observers of progressive politics in Germany to discuss it with. Tobias Dürr is a founding member of Das Progressive Zentrum, one of the driving forces behind it, and a particular expert on social democratic politics in Germany, on Olaf Scholz, on the SPD, so he can bring us that perspective, as well as the bigger picture on what this result means and what to expect from the next weeks. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Ricarda Lang, who is Vice President of the Greens here in Germany. She was elected to the Bundestag in this last election, so congratulations, Ricarda, on that. And she's also part of the Green negotiating team for an upcoming coalition. So what better person to talk to about the Green perspective on all of this? You will be able to ask questions later in this session. Please put them in the chat below and we'll come to those in about 45 minutes. You'll need to leave your name and I'll be calling questions in no particular order, but if you're called, please put your camera and obviously microphone on so that we can hear and see you when you ask those questions. So with that, let's get stuck into the election result. And I suppose the big question, first of all, when I first came to Germany to cover the 2017 election, there was this term Aufbruchsstimmung. Is there a mood of change or a turning point in the country? And the answer in 2017 appeared to be no. I think in this election, there's a lot more to be debated there, whether this was a change election. So I'd like to hear from both of you, first of all, on to what extent you see this result as a mandate for change, as a mandate for something new. Ricarda, perhaps you'd like to come in first. The Greens were the party that saw the biggest gain in terms of percentage points of this election compared to 2017. So what's your perspective on this? Was there an Aufbruchsstimmung to be seen in the results?
I would definitely say so, because I think what we see on a larger scale is that the great coalition that was formed by the Social Democrats and the Conservatives, this was definitely, I think, a coalition that was for many people standing for status quo, for everything staying the way it is, for always looking into the present and not so much into the future. And in many ways, I think this election was a turning point, turning away from the status quo politics and also from a coalition that stands for the present, and there's a little future to be seen in there. Still, I think it's not like we would have expected and wished for a few years, like 1 year ago, for example, as a Green Party, for there being the smaller parties who were smaller parties beforehand. Like you have the big, used to have the big parties, the Conservative and Social Democrats, and then the smaller parties. And for us, we would have wished for especially the Green Party to get more votes and to become as big as the other two parties. I think at this point, it's a step towards a new party system, but not a new party system being realized yet. We see that the old formula of there's one winning party and then there's 1 to 2 small parties that come towards this party. This is not working anymore, but still we could see, especially with the high results for the Social Democrats, that their pole position was defended during the election, also within the more progressive part of the society, where we were kind of like in competition with the Social Democrats for the leading position of the left center part of the society or the progressive part of the society. So I think what we see is a moderate turning point for our party system here in Germany, and therefore definitely a wish for change, and especially, I think, a wish to form a progressive coalition. I think this is what job we have now. This is the Social Democrats, and also, in my opinion, the Liberals do have at this moment. And now we have to see what comes out of that.
And we'll be coming on to that in a second. Thank you for that, Ricarda. Tobias, could you give us perhaps a bit more on the Social Democratic perspective on this? The Social Democrats gained, what was it, some 5 points in this election. They're the biggest party. Very few people would have predicted that a few months ago. And at the same time, they are the party that's been in power for 12 of the last 16 years. Olaf Scholz is Angela Merkel's vice chancellor. The SPD voter base is a little bit older than those of that of, for example, the Greens. Do you think it can be interpreted as a vote for change?
Well, let me first thank you for chairing this, Jeremy, and also let me congratulate Ricarda on being elected to the German Bundestag, which is quite an achievement. Very well done. I mean, there are a few things we must take into account. The Chancellor didn't stand again. Angela Merkel didn't stand again. I think it's a fair guess that the election would have turned out very differently if she had decided to stand again, because people trusted her. There is this center ground in German society, the Merkel middle, you could call it, that trusted her probably more than her party over the last number of years. And now that Merkel didn't stand anymore, they had to decide what to look to, and they decided to change the party to a substantial degree. CDU, CSU, conservatives lost, the Christian Democrats lost 9%, and the three parties that now could come out as the winning coalition together won 12 points. So there was this change, there was this mood for change. We cannot trust the Christian Democrats and I totally agree with Ricarda on that, with governing the country anymore. That was a clear and decisive vote. The CDU is left with 24% of the vote, which is a historic low. To that extent, it's a vote for change. But, and we may discuss that, and I'm only going to say this now. I mean, what kind of Wandel, change, what kind of policy change, change in terms of political culture, etc., do people really expect?
I'd like to. Please. Come in.
If I could add one thing, I think in one way it's rather interesting. I think this election was both a signal of change or a wish for change for many people, and also a wish for stability, especially if Olaf Scholz is being the chancellor candidate for the Social Democrats, which I think out of the three candidates was the person standing more for stability and also kind of like giving people trust in those ways of, well, you know who I am a little bit. This was what was beforehand, I think 4 years ago, and the thing with where Chancellor Merkel went into election with, and now I think the stability point was especially connected to Olaf Scholz. And I think, therefore, maybe we as a Green Party, and I think we were only partially successful in communicating this, but our program for the next years, for the next 20 years, not just the election, we named it Change Brings Stability. And what we were trying to say with that was that I think nowadays as a society, we don't so much stand in front of the decision, do we want change, yes or no? But we see, and I think a lot of society sees, that change is happening. The climate crisis is the biggest change we can imagine as a society, but also when we look on the markets and international scale. And I think the decision more so is, do we try to ignore the change and make it into something that happens to us, so bring ourselves in a passive position, or do we kind of try to politically use the change and also change the way we do politics? And I think in some ways this election was more on the second scale. That was not so much change. Yes, we want everything to change, but more so we see things changing and we need stability, and stability only works with people and also parties who can manage the change, maybe.
So this is everything must change so that everything can stay the same, almost. I find this meeting point between the change impetus and the stability impetus very interesting, and I think that will be a running theme of any traffic light government. Talking of which, I'd like to hear from both of you on that prospect. Obviously, those three parties, the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP, are the three winners. There is a sense of momentum behind that. I think we have to see how the coalition talks go, but I think it looks like the most likely outcome. I'd like to hear from both of you. Do you think, how likely do you think it is? I mean, there is a consensus that it has a good prospects of coming together. There's a lot of will behind it from all three parties, but there are obviously some big differences between the parties, you know, quite aside from policy, almost philosophically as well, you know, in terms of how do you tackle these challenges like climate change? Do you have a state-led, you know, sort of public sector-led answer to climate change or digitization, or do you let the market lead? Big differences in terms of how you see a society and the state. Do you think some sort of common ground could be found? Perhaps you could both give an indication of where you stand on that, but also where you think the most difficult points will be in the coalition talks. Tobias, do you want to jump in on that first?
Yes, I do think that there are enough, that there is enough common ground. Historically, these three parties are those that stood for Fortschritt, progress. There's in the Kaiserreich. In the 19th century, there was a progressive Fortschrittspartei, a liberal party for progressive change that at the time even cooperated with the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats are a party of progress, perhaps sometimes a little statist when they govern for a long time, but the historic idea of social democracy is progress. And the Greens, of course, are a party of progressive transformation. Otherwise, they would never have been founded in the first place. The reason was that they were unhappy with the status quo. They wanted things to change. All these three parties share this basic idea to a much larger extent than some of the present actors perhaps realize, because they are. They think in terms of raising or lowering taxes, but that's not the whole story and shouldn't be. The difficult question will be whether the FDP, the liberals, decide they take their historical heritage as a Fortschritt, as a progressive party seriously, or whether they decide that their recent past has been one of where they are the defenders of a status quo that an idea of lowering taxes, being highly critical of public services and the state, So what is more important for them? That will basically decide where they go.
I think it's fair to say that going in with this CDU-CSU is a pretty unattractive prospect, even for those parts of the FDP that are ideologically aligned. I mean, what a mess, you know, terribly unpopular chancellor candidate, party disunity, you know, a certain amount of political pragmatism must be at play here. But Ricarda, you're involved in this process. I mean, I wonder if you could pick up Tobias's points on how the FDP, or whether the FDP can be brought into this sort of project. You know, the Green Party, in some ways, shares a certain social milieu with the FDP. You know, it's a bit more urban, a bit more fairly highly educated. Someone put it on a discussion I was on last week as two sides of sometimes the same street in sort of some number of German cities. But sort of in the last years, it's felt like the Greens and the FDP are, you know, sort of very much at odds on a lot of the big topics and the big cultural topics as well of our time. How do you see it? Do you think some sort of compromise can be found? And would you pick out any other challenges in these talks other than those that Tobias has raised?
Well, I think I would see 4 possibilities and maybe 2 challenges. I think the first one aligns very good with what you were just talking about. I think maybe a coalition of these 3 parties can kind of pacify some culture wars that have been going on throughout the last years, that have been especially projected onto the Liberals and onto the Green Party. I think even though maybe both parties stand for a part of society that is bigger than themselves, but it has been, when we were talking about eating meat, how to be mobile, what, you know, also a lot of debates on language when it comes to feminism, etc. And for me, most of these debates have been really tiring, because I think they have kind of been rather taking the view away from what is really important, and rather like trying to dematerialize materialistic questions. Tackling the climate crisis is not going to happen because I buy less avocados, or I use Lastenrad, or I don't use Lastenrad. This is going to be really unimportant for everything we have to do during the climate crisis.
I should just say, for non-German speakers, Lastenrad is a cargo bike, and which has for some strange reason become a new icon of the German culture.
Yeah,
anyway,
exactly. That was one big debate we had last year, which shows how ironic it is. And I think if these two parties have to come together based on the challenges we actually face as a society, based on the reality we face, this can kind of pacify this culture wars and really bring us to a point or to a place where we have to talk about measurements and what on a material level can be done and should be done. And I think this could be something really good for society. So a coalition that is focused on reality rather than on cultural impetus and cultural debates that kind of take away the view of reality. I also would agree, I think, with Tobias there that those are maybe the parties that are most focused on the future out of the party system. So therefore, what you called Fortschritt, I think that want something. As stupid as it sounds, but you can, like, especially if you compare to the Conservatives at the moment, you can actually say it's not the same thing we want. In many ways, it goes directly opposite direction, but it is parties that want something that in a way I think make it more interesting to form a coalition than always fighting against someone who doesn't really want anything apart from the status quo being the status quo. And I think therefore it also can be interesting to form a coalition that is not so much like, we call it complementary coalition, where you get a little bit for that, we get the climate, you get the social rights, and the liberals get the digitalization. This is not going to work anymore. I think there needs to be a common vision where we kind of try to find a common perspective for those different kind of ideologies. And I think this can be really interesting, also not just on a political, but on a societal level. But there is the big challenge. I think we're going to find easy compromises on a lot of points and a lot of subjects that are like society-based, for example, when it comes to reproductive rights, when it comes to queer rights, when it comes also to modern migration policies. But I think if there would be a coalition, I think this would be the thing we have to avoid, a coalition that is really progressive on those parts, but on the other hand is not progressive or even regressive when it comes to social and economic politics. This could widen the separation within our society, especially between cities and between the rural areas. And also, I think, between people who feel like change is kind of taking over and who feel also like instability in a social way. And I think therefore the question of investions, the question of economic policies, and also the question of equality and not widening the scale from rich to poor is going to be really important for this coalition not to lose society, also when it is putting forward for societal change.
I'd like to put that point to Tobias, and specifically two follow-up questions. The first is, the SPD, compared to the other two parties in this coalition, has, shall we say, a voter base that is a little closer to the national average. It's older, it's a bit more balanced between urban and rural. It's also more balanced between East and West. I think that's something we can't lose sight of. So first of all is kind of what role would the SPD, particularly as the leading partner in this coalition with Olaf Scholz, and we can talk about him as a prospective chancellor, play in holding all of that together? And I mean, secondly, Ricarda talks about these material aspects beyond the culture wars. And obviously that's where there is a big difference. And you only need to look at the distributional impact of the party programs that were put before Germans at the election to see the big difference between the SPD and the Greens on the one hand, with more of a public investment driven, a more progressive tax and spending profile, and the FDP, which is, comes from a different philosophy economically. How do you see that very material side of these coalition talks kind of being reconciled? So two points there, perhaps.
Well, we haven't yet talked about the Social Democrats' winning strategy, but the winning strategy was very much based on the recognition that all the ideas of reform, transformation, renewal going forward in this society will not get you very, very far unless you bring along the people who feel that change is not always on their side or hasn't been on their side in the last 20 or so years. And I think this very basic, that is a very, very important idea as Olaf Scholz ran on the idea of respect for all people in this country, irrespective of their occupation, their educational status, their biographical background, where they come from. That is a for the time being, that is just a headline, if you will. And now you'd have to tell me, Jeremy, where with the second part of your question.
The second point was on public investment in particular, and where the common ground could be. I mean, there's been interesting talk about, a wealth fund or some sort of investment agency that you could reconcile with the debt brake, which is very important to the Liberals especially, but also is an article of faith for Olaf Scholz as well. Let's not forget that. Where do you see the common ground there that would make possible the sort of investment needed for this modernizing project? Of
course, investment is needed. I mean, there's internationally, if you read the survey on Germany and in the Economist, for example, a few weeks ago before the elections, there's internationally and everywhere there's agreement that this is low investment countries in many ways. At least in public services don't work as well as they should. People in the countryside, in rural areas, feel left behind because the public transport system isn't the way it should be, and all these things. So we'll have to pay for this in some ways. There has to be public investment, and what is important is that this is not that in the arguments or in the discussion among the parties involved here now, this isn't seen as a trade-off kind of thing. The economic, business people, for example, business people who vote for the FDP must or should, I think, realize that this country is based on the support of the people who live here, who work here, and who who have their families here. And if society doesn't work for them, they'll opt out.
It's interesting seeing also in the media, in organizations that often are associated with a sort of free market approach to politics. For example, the Financial Times, have been exploring in the last years much more how you hold societies together, how you sort of save capitalism from itself. So I think there's an interesting line of common ground there. Ricarda, I wonder if you'd like to come in on any of those, but also specifically, as Tobias brought up the Olaf Scholz campaign and this idea of respect and how that played into the result, whether you might also reflect on the Green campaign for a bit. I mean, obviously, for some it was a big step forward, but it was also short of some of the hopes and the expectations of that campaign early on. What's the sense within the party about what went wrong about the campaign, what went right, and the lessons for the future?
Just one sentence, because you just mentioned the Financial Times. I think what we've also been seeing throughout the last years is that the economic debate has changed drastically. So therefore, it's no longer that left parties or center-left parties are kind of like, there's the economic debate and there's the left parties and they're just like talking apart from each other. But I think we have kind of like, a development within the economic debate that leans toward more investments, more infrastructure as a central part of keeping a society together, and also public service as a central part of keeping that together. And I think this has also been rather hard for part of the liberals and also for the conservatives, because kind of like they're, in terms of the Grundzeugne that they could also always like depend on, were certainly not like following the same ideology as them. And I think they have kind of like walked past a path where they could have been like aligning themselves with the economic reality we are experiencing at the moment. But from the question you asked about the Green Party, I think what was the first like most important step with our campaign was having a chancellor campaign. It was the first time for a Green Party in Germany, and I think, I don't know, I'm not trying to like neglect any international parties I don't have on my mind at the moment, but for like a Green Party, I think in general in Europe, I have in my mind at the moment, like to say we are taking a leading position and also approaching this as a leading party within our milieus, and this was the right decision. I think this is really clear for us, even though we didn't come out with the result we wanted in the end. I mean, there's no way of talking apart from that or talking that away. But I think that in many ways, this has also changed the political election campaign in general, like the political election in general at this time, because it was no longer that there's always two parties competing against each other, but certainly there was a third component, and also I think a component of climate crisis brought in a new subject that even though we couldn't for us, I think, highlight the subject big enough to get the votes that result with it, but I think we still managed to change the political debate with that and also change the political system. And what we are seeing at the moment with how the coalition talks are going, this has something to do because we said we want to have a chancellor like a few years ago, like 2 years ago, we took this decision, or 1 year ago, we really finalized this decision. And I think therefore for us in our party development, like I said it right in the beginning, this has been like a step into a direction. It hasn't been like the goal where we wanted to go, but I think it has been a step into the right direction. What for us was rather challenging, I think, and I think this is something where we are going to have to find the right path within the next years, is on the one hand, seeing the climate crisis an existential crisis that influences every part of our society, that influences our security, that influences our health system, that influences how young people are going to live. Well, that's quite rather obvious. And on the other hand, not being the party that is just there for the climate crisis, but not being, like we always say, eco-app is kind of like a condescending word for it, not being this party. And I think this is something we have been struggling with throughout the election campaign, finding the right way of aligning, not saying, well, for us, climate is one of many subjects, because everybody was talking about climate. The SPD was talking about climate, the CDU. So we would have been one more party who says, oh yeah, this is important too. But saying, well, this is the existential subject, and still gaining the trust that we are a leading party. And I think from a leading party, people always expect not to be the party for one subject, but to be a party that in a crisis that nobody expected can lead, in a crisis nobody expected can manage. And this needs to be like of a competence in all areas. And I think this is going to be something where we will be rather finding us within the next 4 years.
Yeah, and if I may say so, having covered both the 2017 election and the 2021 election, it did make a huge difference having Annalena Baerbock as part of the TV debates. I mean, when I look back to that incredibly, if I may say so, boring debate between Angela Merkel and Martin Schulz back in 2017, how much more lively they were. And admittedly, perhaps it was because it was more of a change election anyway, but I think it did make a big positive difference. And since we're talking about the FDP too, perhaps it would have been even more lively with Christian Lindner there. Maybe this is something for next time, you know, especially if they end up in government together. So I think that was definitely a good thing for German democracy and the quality of the debate, absolutely. Very interesting. Well, I'd just like to, before we turn to questions, and thank you to all of those of you who have sent questions, with some really good ones here. So please add yours if you haven't done so yet. One final thought for the main discussion, and that is there's a lot of discussion about some sort of progressive or center-left wave internationally. You know, we've had a generation-defining election in the US with the election of Joe Biden. You know, social democracy, especially if Olaf Scholz ends up in the chancellery here in Berlin, will be probably stronger, you know, by European comparison in the next year or so than it has been for a long time. You know, the Social Democratic Party family will be the largest at the European Council. We're also seeing Greens win elections in a lot of countries and you know, rising up in things like municipal elections in France or in other parts of the continent. So I suppose the big question is, are we seeing some sort of shift towards the center-left, Europe-wide and internationally? Or are these isolated or individual cases to do with local circumstances? Tobias, what's your view on that?
I definitely do think that we're seeing that shift. At least the the seeds are there for establishing that shift, because as Barack Obama always said, the fierce urgency of now. I mean, people realize that, he was quoting Martin Luther King there, I think, because people realize that things are getting more and more urgent in terms of the climate crisis and globalization and the future of their jobs in all these changes that are coming, and they want something new.
Greater than the sum of its parts. Ricarda, what's your view on this? Do you think we are seeing some wider shift in the zeitgeist, towards the center left?
I think it's really interesting and also a little bit funny for me that we are asking this question right now, because I remember back when the last election we had here in Germany in 2017, everybody was talking about the Rechtsruck, so like the leaning of the society towards the right-wing parties, and like Tobias already said, they're not gone. The AfD, especially in the East, we have it's turning more into a geographic problem and not so much into a problem that faces the whole of society in the same way, but they are still there. But still, for me, it's really interesting that 4 years ago, this was the big fear, I think, of most democratic parts of society, that there's going to be the rise of the left, of the right-wing parties. We saw that with the election of Trump. We saw that in many countries, and how fast the times have changed. And now we are talking about the zeitgeist leaning towards the left part. But I think it is something that is actually happening, because reality is kind of pushing people towards that. I don't think it's for many people so much a decision that they are like ideologically saying, well, I am like a convinced lefty now at the moment. But I think it's that they are seeing, when we see the challenges that reality brings to us, especially the climate crisis. But I would also say, for example, a society where migration is just normal, where everybody knows someone that has people, that has parents that were born from another country, that is not called Lang with their last name, but maybe Charlie, then they just see, well, what kind of politics fits these challenges? And I think this needs to be a politics that is prepared to change something, and also to change up things, and to be focused on the future. And I think, therefore, many people are now leaning towards the left politics, because, well, it's just what they see fitting towards reality, especially when you go towards younger people. And I think also that kind of this neoliberal zeitgeist is coming to an end, where the thought for many people was that individually you can change everything. We don't really need a state, we don't really need collectives. You just, when we, like, for example, look towards the climate crisis, you need to buy differently. You need to be mobile differently. You need to do this and this and this. And I think many, especially young people, have seen, well, we tried that, and look, the subventions are still going to the fossil industry. It doesn't change anything what we do on an individual level. And I think, therefore, the role of the state and also the role of collective measurements and collective actions has changed for many people. And this is also something where the left reciprocates. And I think on last time, this is not written down for the next years. We can't say, well, now this is happening, and this is going for years, there's going to be so many left wins on an international scale. But I think it's a possibility, because a few years ago, when we were talking about, still 1 year ago, when we were talking about the German election, there was always in the political Berlin, for many people, the thought, you can only get votes within your social camp. The Green Party can get votes from the Social Democrats, the FDP can get votes from the Conservatives. And now we see that this is not true. Center-left has won on a total within this election. And therefore we see social camps are not something that are static, but they can be changed with good election campaigns and with policies that fit the reality. And I think this is a huge possibility for us, but also for democracies.
Well, that's a very good point on which to turn to our questions, because it touches on a lot of the points people are actually asking about. Before we come to those that have been submitted in the chat, and you still have time to do so if you want to add yours to those, I'd like to turn for a reaction to Josef Lensch, who is managing partner at the Innovation in Politics Institute here in Germany, here in Berlin, and the author of Political Entrepreneurship. Josef, are you out there? I can't currently see you, but I think you need to turn on your camera and say hello.
Hi, Jeremy. Hi there.
Great to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to turn to you. You're involved obviously in this question of political innovation, but also have worked with the liberal NEOS party in Austria. So could we have a liberal perspective on this election result from you? Particularly of interest to me is the fact that the FDP did so well among young people in particular, very striking, along with the Greens. Maybe you'd want to talk a bit about that and your general perceptions of the result.
Sure. So I think, if you look at the FDP, obviously the party has been through a journey since 4 years ago. And I think what we can see now, there's a real appetite for reform-focused government and real creative change. What we can also, we have already seen that in the way how the coalition talks were approached. This unconventional citrus coalition that was formed in the coalition talks was already something new. I think, if the question is what about progressive change, I think it depends on your understanding of progressive. I think if you think about it as fortschritt, then absolutely, I think the FDP is up for that. Also for reform, but in a centrist way and not necessarily left. And I think this is where some of the risks lie. I think if you frame the coalition negotiations as kind of light versus dark, or progress versus regress, or firing up the culture wars, I think there's a big risk in creating fissures there. So I think it will require a high dose of pragmatism. I think it will require the ability to govern complexity creatively. I think that is possible. And after all, as Marion Dönhoff said, a liberal of the past, the legitimate place of the liberal is between all chairs, and I think that's a real opportunity here. For all parties involved. And we know internationally and also from Germany, from Rhineland-Palatinate, that traffic light coalitions can work. So I'm quite optimistic. But of course, as both Ricarda and Tobias have said, the proof of the pudding remains in the eating. And so we'll see the next weeks what will come of it.
What do you make about that youth support for the FDP? Do you see it as support for a sort of a broad sense of modernization, or do you see particular policies of the FDPs that appeal to younger voters?
I think, if you look at issues like digitization in Germany, and generally kind of how open, how creative the public sector is, how entrepreneurship is being supported. I think there's a lot to do there, and I agree. Germany is a low investment country, but that's kind of part of the equation, right? It's also, again, how Germany understands its public service, how supportive it is to entrepreneurs, how education is being organized. I think, particularly in the last couple of years, we have seen a lot of issues there. And I think the FDP has been, over the last years, been a voice of criticizing that, and also showing potentially some vision how it could be different. So I think to a lot of young people, this has been attractive, and this is why I think they have been that successful.
Thank you.
Can I just make one point, perhaps?
Yeah.
I think it is these. I think it was 23 and 24% youth vote for FDP and Greens. I think that is a very interesting thing, and as a sort of a suggestion for further research, I should suggest we urgently need to know how these groups behave toward one another. Is there a middle ground, or do they see themselves as standing antagonistically toward each other? That is immensely important, and I don't know that yet, but we need to know that, because a lot of the possibility of this coalition and the sort of establishing this coalition culturally within society depends on that, on whether these people can, come together or see themselves as enemies forced into an alliance where they don't want to be, really.
Absolutely. Ricarda, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, because I think this is really, really interesting. And I have been like a lot of debate throughout the last week. Also, sometimes when I was like making fun of young people who were voting the FDP and stuff like this, where I was like, well, if you
Ricarda,
want to take
how could you?
Yeah, I didn't do it, because I would actually say, if you want to take young people seriously, you should take them seriously, even if they make a decision you would not take for yourself. So this is something kind of also having to do with respect, maybe, to quote Olaf Scholz. No, but I think this is a really interesting question, because on the one hand, it shows that this kind of like the thought of like the youth wants this, the youth wants that, obviously is not working, because I think someone who votes for the Green Party or someone who votes for the Liberals has a different political perspective and also favors different policies. So you see that it's not like the youth, but there's like different fractions within the youth as well, which is kind of normal in democracy. But I think what could be a combining factor, and I would agree that this would be really interesting to do studies on, because this now just is like my feeling, but I would think that the focus on subjects where young people felt like the Great Coalition has just let them lie down and has kind of ignored them. I think this is for climate protection, also for like social perspective for young people. For example, what will they get when they are old themselves? This is for education. And I think all the subjects where they were felt like, combined with the Corona crisis, where many young people felt that the government was ruling over their heads and their interests were not seen, I think they lean towards party where they felt that their interests that were ignored throughout the last 4 years were best represented. This can be different interests, but I think therefore it's kind of young people turning away from the Great Coalition because they do not feel represented with their policies.
Absolutely. Well, I think a Green MP citing Olaf Scholz in defense of young FDP voters is a very traffic lighty kind of vibe for us. So congratulations there. Let's turn to the questions with that. And I'm going to come to you each one by one, those who've asked their questions. There are some really good ones here. So please do keep your comments to your question rather than giving us a short speech, because otherwise we won't be able to get through everyone's. So I'm going to call, first of all, Sabina Arnaud of Challenges magazine in Paris. Sabina, could you switch your camera and your microphone on so you can ask this question? And I would probably direct it at Tobias, actually, although if Ricarda or Josef want to come in, you can do so too. So Sabina, over to you.
Good afternoon. Can you listen? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Because I have a problem with my microphone. Do you mind reading the questions? And because I can hear you very well, but I have the impression that the connection.
I can hear you fine, but I'll read it out myself. But thank you, thank you for sending it in.
Thank you so much.
No problem. So two questions on Olaf Scholz for the experts. How is a cohabitation between a centre-right Scholz, I think that's a reference to his position within the SPD rather than generally, and the centre-left part of the SPD possible in the long run? Will Scholz be able to get on with a personality like Kühnert? That's a reference to Kevin Kühnert, the leader of the Young Socialists, and quite a force in the new parliament, and vice versa. She also asks what the strengths and the weaknesses of Scholz are as Chancellor. Tobias, would you like to come in? I think particularly on that first point about relations within the SPD.
I think it's a misunderstanding, basically, to say that Olaf Scholz is a center-right or conservative social democrat. His legacy is a different one. I mean, what he has done, what he has stressed in this campaign is the importance of bringing the little guy back into social democratic politics, and in doing so, he has not just adopted, but I think wholeheartedly supported some of the suggestions that are very important to the party left, like the so-called education guarantee for young people. There's no serious policy debate going on there. There's no antagonism going on there, and I doubt that this will end. Plus, I mean, he won the. He was the figurehead, the most important person. He formulated the strategy, the successful strategy, and not only did the Social Democrat under his leadership won 5%. In comparison to the last Bundestagswahl election, but he brought them back 10 or more % from where they were in the polls just a couple of months ago. So that will strengthen his position immensely, I think, within the party. And the Social Democratic Party has made enough mistakes in the past to, I think, easily lose sight of that the importance of their unity right now. I don't think that will be a major problem. I cannot just add that within the government, within the parliamentary group of the Social Democrats, there are a lot of young people. It's true that the voters are older, the Social Democratic voters, but if this is a future-oriented, if it is going to be a future-oriented coalition, then also count in the very young members of parliament that have been voted into parliament for the Social Democrats.
Yeah, absolutely. And just any quick reflections on Olaf Scholz's strengths and weaknesses? Just a couple of key points, perhaps.
His strength. He's well, like I said, he formulated he is a very, very analytical person. He understood a lot of things that went wrong within his own party, the German Social Democratic Party, in recent years, and he saw what happened he understood what happened in the USA, where a populist like Donald Trump was elected president, and he understood what happened in terms of what went wrong within society when Britain voted for Brexit, and he drew the right conclusions from that, and even more importantly, he stuck to his strategy when people were beginning to feel itchy and say, will this work? Our poll numbers the needle doesn't move, and he kept to his to his strategy and to his concepts, and also perhaps a bit under discussed in this discussion, this respect, this idea of respect, of nobody in a society looking down on other members of the society because of their jobs, because of their background, etc. That resonated so much, and that is his. That is Olaf Scholz's personal contribution. So I think most of all, it's everybody makes a huge mistake who says that he's just stood there with this Merkel kind of hands and comparing him to Merkel and saying that he's just going to continue. He just wants to continue like Angela Merkel. They couldn't be more wrong. I firmly believe that.
Interesting. At the risk of being totally shameless, for viewers who want to read more on Olaf Scholz and his politics, I profiled him for the New Statesman a few weeks ago, so you may or may not want to look at that. I'd like to turn now to Jan Kloppenburg, who asks a very good question, which I will probably direct at Ricarda. Jan, if you're there, can you turn on your microphone and video and ask us your question? Hello, Jan, are you there? I can see you now.
Try. Oh yeah, now I'm in the discussion. Oh yes, thank you very much for inviting me to ask a question. I wonder if, the liberals feel politically closer to the conservatives anyway, but I wonder if especially the Greens might feel tempted to talk about coalition with the conservatives, because we know that the conservatives have a pretty weak and unpopular leader. They just lost the election, and they're a bit famous for having hardly any political goals anyway. So might you feel tempted to try to talk coalition talks with them to really to fill this void and to have a much stronger role within that coalition than the Greens might have compared to a pretty strong and confident Social Democrats with a strong and popular leader?
Well, first of all, you do have the challenge that I think it is rather obviously, if you compare our party programs, we have the most combining subjects and also combining goals and policies with the Social Democrats. And still, this can make it rather difficult, because it's always like for the party that has to move the furthest, there can be like, if you think like just like with party interests and not with a common goal, you could get to a point where I say, the party that has to move the furthest gets the most. So therefore it would be easier for us to get something out of a coalition with the conservatives and easier for the liberals to get something out of a coalition with the Social Democrats. But I think this is if you just like mainly focus on the party interest. And if you just think, well, our party interest would be to be the strongest partner within a coalition. But I think you should also have an interest, and I think we do have this as a Green Party, of a government working all together, of a government being able to formulate a vision that works together, that brings together different parts. And I in no way see at the moment how this should be able with the Conservatives that don't even have their own like vision of how society to work, but you could try to form a common vision. I think this would be the one challenge. The second challenge would be if we face crisis as a society, and this will happen within the next 4 years. I think, well, the last 20 years maybe have shown us that there will not be a 4 years where we're not facing a crisis, and you don't have a chancellor that is rather weak. I think this is a problem for society, but also for the government as a whole. And I think a government should not be a place where it's mainly a competition between the party who gets out the best, because this will keep us from tackling the challenges that we need to tackle. I mean, especially if we look toward the climate crisis, there's not much time left. It's not like, well, we're going to play government for 4 years, so then 4 years we get out stronger, but we need a functioning government right now, because speed is everything when it comes to the climate crisis.
Thanks for that, Ricarda. I'd like to now call, I'm actually going to call 2 questioners so we can get 2 in at once, and then I'll put that to both Tobias and Ricarda. First, could we hear, please, from Eldad Beck, who asks a good question on foreign policy. And then after that, I'll ask for Eva Turkay to come in with her. So first of all, Eldad, are you there? And if so, can you put your camera on and your microphone? Hi.
Hi, thank you very much. In light of the tremendous interior challenges of the coming government, to what extent would foreign policy play part in the work of a possible Ampelkoalition, and how would this foreign policy look like?
Thank you very much for that. And could we hear from you, Eva, as well? If you're there, could you put your video on and your microphone and pose your question? Hi, Eva, are you there? I feel like I'm hosting Eurovision. Okay, I think we may not have Eva, but anyway, I think there's a lot to discuss there in that question from Eldad. Tobias, do you want to come in first on the question of foreign policy?
Yeah, first let me say that from my point of view, it was rather unfortunate how little foreign policy and Europe was debated in this campaign. It was no issue at all in the debates, and the parties and the party leaders didn't see much reason to debate it in public. Now that is a problem or pity, because of course foreign policy, international affairs are extremely important, and for the future of our country, Europe. And so there should have been perhaps more debates, because some of the issues that are there could pop up in the coalition now as the future coalition partners get together. Let me just say that in Russia, China, there are sort of say philosophical differences between, if you can call them philosophical. There are differences between the Greens and some social democrats. And it's human rights issues that all that can be papered over with formula compromises, but that could make things more difficult later on. As Ricarda says, there will always be crisis, and it would definitely be better to figure out sort of a as much common ground as possible for SPD and FDP and the Greens.
Ricarda, can you come in on that? And also Eva says that she can't, having trouble switching on her camera and mic. So I'll read out her question for her, and perhaps you could pick that one up too. She asks, do you expect any change in tackling the Orban problem? very much related to this, I think, e.g. exposing companies.
That's another example, yeah.
Exactly, with them. So do you want to come in on that, Ricarda, and the broader question?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I would totally agree with Tobias when it comes to the campaign and the election in total, that it was rather, well, irritating how little we were talking about foreign policies, especially because the Afghanistan crisis was like on display during this time. And I think, well, we were talking about Afghanistan, but only about a very little part about how to get the people out of there, which was important, which is still like an embarrassment how much we failed with that. But there were so many questions standing behind this crisis. For example, our dependency on the US when it comes to foreign policy, the strategic sovereignty of the European Union. And I think this could be like, I think two things I would say where I would expect and also wish for a rather big change when it comes to foreign policies. First of all, strategic sovereignty of the European Union. We need to have a European foreign policy, which we don't have at the moment, which then also leads us to the question how to form this and how to like tackle autocrats and also dictators within the European Union. And I think we can expect change there because, for example, like Orban has been part of the Conservative Party family for a way too long time. So therefore, there was always like not enough done to counteract them. Still, I think we have to be honest that also for a progressive coalition, it's not going to be so easy because what we would actually need is to get rid of the, to enable Mehrheitsentscheidungen. Well, that not all parties, like not anonymous votes within the European Union. And this is a hard step. I think we all want it. I think it's part of all of our party programs, but this would need to happen. And also, I think we need to look at how money is distributed within the European Union and how to support, for example, cities and regions within countries like Poland and Hungary that are supporting LGBTIQ rights, that are supporting refugees' rights, etc. So I think there will be a change, but it would be kind of naive to say we're going to change it from today to tomorrow because it's not this easy to tackle that problem. And I think the other part would be a more human rights focus on foreign policy, especially when it comes to kind of evaluation when you have a contradiction of human rights and economic interest of Germany. I think human rights should play a bigger part, and I think therefore a coalition with our three parties could be a way to get there.
Yeah, if I may throw in a personal view here, I think one thing that I'd hope for from the next government would be to work more with the Hungarian opposition. You know, we're coming up to a big election next year. There is a real chance to unseat Orban.
Yes, totally.
And that's an opportunity that Germany, and I hope Germany's next government will support. We haven't talked a great deal about Europe in this discussion, but fortunately, Georgi Perinsky has asked a very good question on that. So Georgi, if you're there, do you want to switch your microphone and camera on and put that question to us? If not, I can read this one out too. Okay, I'm not seeing Georgi, so I will read it out myself. He asks, what are the chances for a new sustainability pact to supplant the austerity-driving EU Stability and Growth Pact, an idea that Olaf Scholz supported? So obviously is, reflects the fact that a big discussion is coming up about the SGP next year and a big topic for the next government. Would either of you like to come in on that? A quick word from you, Tobias, seeing as we mentioned.
I think that depends a lot on things that we don't know yet, that we debated earlier on, of whether the three parties involved now can find enough economic common ground economically or not. What I can say is that Olaf Scholz, I think the Greens as well, and have Europe in mind all the time when they when they think about the future of Germany. So I can't say anything about the conceptual aspect here, but what I know is that Europe is seen by the players involved as a much more important thing than it looked like during the campaign. which again is a very unfortunate. It was an unfortunate thing, but it is seen by German leaders, German progressive leaders, as more important than it looked like during the campaign.
I'd like to hear from you on that, Ricarda, but just before we do, I'd like to bring in a final question, which I think would be a good one to put to you in any case, from Noah Schmidt. Noah, are you there? And if so, could you put your camera and mic on and put your question? And then I'll let Ricarda pick that up, and the last one too.
Hey, yeah, thanks for the honor of the final question. So what I'm curious about, since Ricarda, you talked about the neoliberal zeitgeist, and one of the contrasts between the liberals and the Greens that often pointed out with respect to the climate crisis and the means to sort of tackle that challenge is the question of where do the investments go? Into the market, or does it go through the public hand? So what I'm curious about is, where do you see sort of a possible balance that needs to be struck between the two to tackle that challenge?
Should I start? Well, I think what we might overcome with, I think, the next government is kind of like this dualism between the markets and the state, and kind of the thinking of either the states can handle it or the market can handle it, because both of this perspective are kind of shortened and not like meeting the needs of reality. But I think we need both, and I think we need a better cooperation between the both of them. For example, if you need like Mariana Mazzucato, I think there's a lot of ideas out there how the public sector and the private sector can more cooperate. And I think this is also the thing when it comes to investments. We're going to need a huge deal of private investments. I think this is totally clear. But I think to get them and kind of to like also to, well, have an influence where new markets should kind of surface, where money should go, we need public investments. And therefore, I think the public investments for us at the moment are kind of like the ride or die point to also influence where the private investments are going to go and if there's going to be enough of private investments. So I think a better cooperation, but it's not going to work without the public investments, in my opinion. And this is also going to be one of the biggest, I think, tasks for the next government, to enable those public investments. And now, because we don't have a majority that's going to change our Grundgesetz, well, we need to be a little bit creative when it comes to that.
Tobias, a very quick final word from you on that.
Yeah, I think that I'd stress that between the Greens and the Social Democrats on this issue, there's not much difference at all. I mean, what the Greens see and what the Social Democrats see is that private investors, private companies, industry, you know, the steel industry, the chemical industry, the concrete industry, all these industries that are so important in the car industry, all these industries, the tool industry, all these industries that are so important in Germany are waiting for the state, for government to give them a framework they can rely on and so they can make the right investments. And they also have to know if we make the investments we have to make in order to comply with climate needs. Where will the money come from until we make money, until we earn a profit with what we do here? And that's where the state comes in. And the Greens have suggested a plan here, and the Social Democrats have suggested a plan here. And I'm not an expert on this, but they don't differ very much. I believe the idea is very much the same. And once again, the question is, will that be shared by the FDP? Will they see that there's a role for the state to play in order to make private business work under the conditions of transformation that we're in now?
I think that's a very good point on which to end. So thank you very much for that. And thank you, Noah, for a very good question. And thank you to all of you who've sent in questions. I hope we'll give you some satisfactory answers. Just to round up, a reflection from me, I mean, in my own writing and the New Statesman, we've been optimistic about the possibilities of this traffic light government. And it seems to me, listening to these comments over the last hour and 15 minutes, there are two ways that such a government could go. One is that it's all about the lowest common denominator, and it's who gets what, who manages to kind of get their way on this or that. And as I think Ricarda said, it becomes you have this area, you have that area that matters to you, and I have this area. And it seems to me that sort of government, where you see everything as a series of zero-sum dials, more state, more market, more green, more liberal, more social, is a recipe for a government that disappoints, and a recipe for a government that doesn't hold together politically. And that's the one way. And the other way, it seems to me, is actually a sense of a properly coherent project with common ownership, where you say we pool our different approaches to these things to try and make something better than what we can do alone or fragmented. And that if in these coalition talks, the three parties can form something genuinely cohesive, something genuinely new, that brings together the best of what each of them have to offer, it could be tremendously exciting indeed for Germany, and indeed for sort of progressivism internationally. So here's hoping we get the second sort of government. If a traffic light comes together at all, we need to remember it's still possible that it won't. So with that, I'd like to say a very big thank you to Tobias Dürr. Thank you, Tobias.
Thank you.
And to Ricarda Lang. Thank you for joining us, Ricarda.
Thank you.
Congratulations again on your election. I've been Jeremy Cliffe from the New Statesman. Thank you to Das Progressive Zentrum for hosting this, and thank you to all of you who joined us to listen and participate. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.